My name is Alex. I'm 68 years old, and these days, I spend most of my time on the couch near the window, watching the light move across the floor like it's trying to remind me that time never stops, not even for old men like me. The house is quieter than I'd like, quieter than it used to be. It's not just the absence of voices, it's the absence of being needed. I've raised a daughter, buried a wife, built a company from scratch, and still, somehow, I ended up here. The old man on the couch. A background character in the story of his own family. They don't say it out loud, but I see it in the way they look at me, like I'm just furniture. My grandson once handed me the remote and said, "Here, Grandpa, you like those black and white shows, right?" I smiled, said thank you, and let it go. But deep down, I wondered, when did my opinion stop matching? When did my experience become outdated? Lucas, my son-in-law, is one of those people who lives like he's got something to prove every time he opens his mouth. He talks fast, dresses sharp, and throws around buzzwords like they're magic spells. Disruption, scalability, market dominance. I used to speak a different kind of language, one built on trust, grit, and long days at a desk with more questions than answers. Lucas calls it the old way. I call it surviving when nobody thought you would. At family dinners, I sit at the far end of the table. I'm not assigned that seat. It just happens. People like Lucas tend to command the center. He laughs loudly, clinks glasses, tells stories where he's always the hero. My daughter smiles nervously beside him, nodding at the right moments, pretending not to notice when he cuts me off mid-sentence or changes the subject when I try to speak. I don't blame her. Love makes you defend the indefensible sometimes. Last Sunday, after dinner, I stayed behind to help gather the dishes. No one asked me to. I just needed to feel useful. As I passed by the hallway toward the kitchen, I heard Lucas talking on the phone in the den. His voice was confident, full of swagger. The old guy, he doesn't even know what startup is. Seriously, he thinks seed funding is about farming. I froze. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, that condescension that drips off people who believe they're untouchable. And the worst part? He wasn't wrong about the terminology. I haven't kept up with every trend. But what he doesn't understand is that I've seen enough cycles, enough markets crash and rise again, enough people like him come and go with their LinkedIn quotes and overconfidence. The only difference is, I don't advertise what I know. That night, I didn't say a word. I finished cleaning the dishes, folded the dish towel, and said goodbye with the same gentle voice I've always used. But something shifted inside me. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. I realized I was no longer dealing with arrogance. I was watching it rot the roots of my own family. And the truth is, it hurt more than I expected. You ever feel like you're in a room full of people who love you, but you're still invisible? That's how I felt for the past few years. Like I became part of the scenery. Like my silence was mistaken for irrelevance. They don't ask me about my past anymore. They don't know the years I spent eating cold noodles at midnight while building a company I later sold just to pay off my wife's medical bills. They don't know that the biggest deal I ever made was over a handshake in a parking lot, not a PowerPoint in a boardroom. Lucas thinks he's the first man to charm a board of investors. He thinks calling someone bro and having a podcast makes him untouchable. And I let him believe that. I let everyone believe that. Because sometimes the most powerful position isn't the one at the head of the table. It's the one watching quietly from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. That moment isn't here yet, but it's coming. Because what Lucas doesn't know, what none of them know, is that I never really stepped away from the game. I just changed the angle from which I play it. While they've been chasing spotlights, I've been building networks behind the curtain. No one suspects the old man on the couch. No one asks what he's reading, who he's emailing, or what meetings he takes on early mornings when the house is still asleep. And I prefer it that way. You see, when people underestimate you, they give you power. They give you time. They give you the element of surprise. And at my age, I've learned that revenge isn't loud. It's not dramatic. It's not a viral moment or a confrontation at dinner. Real revenge is quiet. It's earned. And when it arrives, it feels less like a strike and more like balance being restored. So I sit here, day after day, watching the light move across the floor, letting them believe I've retired not just from work, but from life. Letting them laugh. Letting them call me irrelevant. Letting Lucas think he's untouchable. Because soon, very soon, he'll be in a room where no one's laughing. and the president of the company will stand up, shake my hand, and say, "Mr. Alex, thank you for coming. I found out about the meeting by accident. Not through an email, not a phone call, just a slip of conversation over breakfast when my daughter mentioned she'd be home late because Lucas has that big strategy session today." I stirred my coffee slowly, acting like I hadn't heard. But inside, something tightened in my chest. I smiled, nodded, and changed the subject. What else could I do? It wasn't the first time I'd been left out of something important. But this one stung in a different way. Because this wasn't just some casual lunch or family gathering. This was a meeting with investors. A strategic planning session for the company I helped build. My company. Or at least, it used to be. Lucas had been planning it for weeks. I knew that now. He'd cleared his schedule, updated his slide deck, probably practiced his visionary leader tone in the mirror. And somehow, in all that preparation, I hadn't even crossed his mind. Or worse, maybe I had. And he decided I wasn't worth the chair. You learn, with time, to recognize the difference between being forgotten and being erased. Later that morning, I asked my daughter about it gently. I didn't accuse, didn't raise my voice. Just asked, like a man asking if he'd left the porch light on. She looked up from her tea, eyes fluttering just a second too long before she answered. "Oh, I think Lucas figured you wouldn't really be interested, Dad. It's all very technical." Technical, right? I could have told her that in the early days, I wrote every financial model by hand, with nothing but a calculator and the back of an invoice. That I once spent 3 nights awake building a pitch deck that saved 30 jobs. That I taught one of Lucas's mentors how to read a balance sheet before he had facial hair. But I didn't say any of that. I just smiled, again, and nodded, like a man slowly learning to disappear without making a scene. She meant well. I could tell. She didn't say it to hurt me. She said it to protect the illusion. The illusion that everything was fine. That her husband was sharp and competent and in control. That her father was peacefully retired, unbothered, better off not being in the way. That illusion was easier to live within the truth. That maybe her father still had more to give. Maybe he wasn't done yet. I spent the rest of that day walking. No destination. Just letting my shoes find a rhythm my thoughts couldn't. There's something about a long walk that helps you process what the heart can't quite hold. I walked past the office building where I signed my first lease. It's a gym now. I passed the cafe where I used to meet clients. It's a vape shop. Everything changes. Everything moves on. Except the things we carry. You ever wonder when, exactly, people start writing you off? It doesn't happen all at once. It's subtle. At first, they stop asking your opinion. Then, they start finishing your sentences. Then, one day, they plan a meeting and don't even think to invite you. And the saddest part, no one notices what they've done, except you. I got home just before dinner. Lucas wasn't back yet. My daughter was setting the table, humming some tune from her college days. She looked happy, lighter than usual. I didn't want to ruin that. So I helped slice the bread, poured the water, made the same small talk I always do. I didn't ask how the meeting went. I didn't need to, because deep down, I knew what happened. Lucas had stood at the front of that room, laser pointer in hand, delivering his grand ideas to a table of investors who thought they were hearing something new. He probably referenced next-gen scalability and lean operational pivots. He probably sprinkled in some graphs, some projections, maybe a success story or two. But what none of them realized, what Lucas didn't even realize, is that the foundation he stood on was built by someone else's hands. Mine. That night, after they went to bed, I sat in the dark living room for a long time. No TV, no lights, just me and the quiet. And I thought about all the ways we let people take pieces of us, little by little, until there's nothing left but a shadow of who we used to be. Maybe you felt that too. Maybe you've looked around and realized you're no longer the protagonist in your own story. Maybe, like me, you've been sidelined in the name of progress, packaged into a silent role you never agreed to play. The wise elder, the harmless grandpa, the retired founder who smiles and waves but doesn't interfere. But something shifted in me that night. Again, not anger, not revenge, just this deep, still understanding that I had allowed myself to shrink, that I had handed over the reins too quickly, that I had mistaken peace for silence. And maybe that was about to change, because this wasn't just about a missed invitation. It wasn't about a meeting or a spreadsheet or some trend Lucas thought he understood better than I did. It was about respect and how easily it vanishes when people start seeing you as obsolete. But I'm not obsolete. And this time, I won't let it slide. Before I was the old man on the couch, I was the kid nobody bet on. I didn't come from money. I didn't go to an Ivy League school. What I had was grit, a knack for numbers, and a talent for reading people, really reading them. The kind of reading that tells you who'll fold under pressure, who'll chase easy money, and who has the patience to build something that lasts. I started the company with two friends, Tom and Ray. We were nobodies back then. Three guys working out a shared office above a dry cleaner. The floor creaked when you walked. The radiator hissed all winter. And every morning, we'd unlock that cheap glass door like we were walking into a Fortune 500 headquarters. Because in our minds, we already were. The business started simple. Financial consulting for small manufacturers who were tired of being chewed up by banks that didn't understand their world. We spoke their language. We didn't wear ties. We didn't push dreams we couldn't back up. And we always showed up. That alone got us more clients than our competitors knew what to do with. Within 5 years, we had a team. Within 10, we had branches. And within 15, we had options. Real ones. Offers. Buyouts. IPO talk. But money changes people. And pressure reveals the cracks. Tom wanted out. Said he was tired. Said he'd made enough. He wanted to move to Arizona and golf. Ray? He was hungry. But not in the same way I was. He wanted attention. Titles. To see his name in magazines. I wanted legacy. I wanted something that would outlive me. Not just flash for a season. So we struck a deal. I sold part of my shares. Just enough to give my wife the life she deserved. Medical care. Travel. A home without stairs. Because the chemo made her legs weak. I never regretted that part. Not once. But with that sale, I stepped back from the front. I stopped being the face of the company and started becoming the foundation underneath it. What no one really knew, not Tom, not Ray, not even my daughter, was that I never let go completely. While they focused on the stage lights, I was wiring the backstage. I set up holding companies, trusted partners, silent ownership stakes. I invested in tools that gave me insight into decisions long before they reached public ears. I didn't do it out of mistrust. I did it out of instinct. Because I knew the day would come when I'd need to protect what I built. You ever look back and realize the smartest thing you did was not walk away? That's what this chapter of my life feels like. A quiet affirmation that the seeds I planted decades ago are still growing, even if no one sees my fingerprints on the roots. I remember the day we signed our first major deal. It was a cold March afternoon. We were in a client's break room because they didn't have a conference room. Coffee-stained table, flickering lights. We slid over a contract that would save their business in double hours. When they shook our hands, their CFO said something I'll never forget. You guys didn't talk like bankers. You talk like us. That's who I was. That's who I still am. I don't care for suits that cost more than a mortgage. I don't care for speeches full of noise and empty metaphors. What I care about is impact. Quiet, real impact. The kind that feeds families and secures futures. So when Lucas walks around acting like the company just sprouted out of thin air the moment he showed up, I don't get angry. Not anymore. I just watch. I observe. Because he doesn't know where the walls came from. He's decorating a house built by other men's calloused hands. And one day, when the cracks start to show, he'll wish he understood the foundation. I used to think legacy was about buildings with your name on them. Now I know it's something else entirely. Legacy is what echoes after your name stops being mentioned. It's the systems you put in place. The people you lifted when no one was watching. The foresight to stay quiet when noise was fashionable. I didn't stay in the game to be applauded. I stayed because I knew that leadership isn't always loud. Sometimes it's invisible. It shows up in stability, in foresight, in resilience. And I had plenty of that. Tom moved to Arizona. Ray got his magazine covers. And me? I became the quiet shareholder. The one whose name no longer appeared in press releases, but whose influence still whispered through every major decision, whether they realized it or not. Because, while they were talking about stepping away from the game, I was learning how to become the referee. And let me tell you something. Once you learn how the rules are made, it's a lot easier to know when to blow the whistle. It started with a headline. Nothing major. Just a small announcement in a trade bulletin most people wouldn't bother reading. Something about a strategic alignment between a mid-sized consultancy and a European investment group. Harmless enough. But something about the wording, too polished, too vague, made me pause. I clicked the article. Buried 3 paragraphs down, almost like it didn't want to be found, was the name of the acquiring firm. A shell company, based in Luxembourg. I'd seen that name before. Years ago, during a potential merger we backed out of. The terms were predatory then. I doubted they'd changed. I followed the trail. A few hours later, I was staring at a digital press release, scheduled, but not yet published, mentioning a pending equity adjustment that would increase stakeholder diversity. A lot of corporate jargon for what was really happening. Someone was selling a chunk of our company. Quietly. Without a vote. Without a whisper. And that someone was Lucas. I knew it before I even confirmed it. Because this is exactly how people like him operate. Flashy in public, slippery in private. They make moves under the assumption that no one's watching. That experience is something you can outpace with charm and speed. What they don't realize is that experience doesn't shout. It waits. The documents I found weren't technically illegal, but they were unethical. Lucas had built a presentation showing projected growth numbers that were generous, to say the least. Inflated by selective data, questionable market comparisons, and best-case scenarios dressed up as forecasts. It was the kind of report that makes rookies excited and veterans nervous. And then there was the real problem. The buyer wasn't just some silent investor. They had a history, one that involved gutting companies, replacing leadership, and flipping the remains for short-term gain. This wasn't a partnership. It was a setup. And Lucas, in his arrogance, thought he was playing the game. He didn't realize he was being played. I sat back in my chair, trying to calm the heat rising in my chest. This wasn't just business. This was personal. He was risking everything. Not just the company, but the jobs, the legacy, the relationships that had taken decades to build, all for the illusion of being a visionary. You ever watch someone drive toward a cliff while smiling for the camera? That's what it felt like. I thought about confronting him directly, walking into his office, dropping the documents on his desk, watching his smug expression crack. But then I remembered the meeting I wasn't invited to. The way he looked through me like I was just an outdated relic sitting at his dinner table. No, confrontation would only feed his ego. He'd twist it, call me emotional, say I was overstepping, maybe even gaslight me into thinking I'd misunderstood. No, this would have to be different. I needed to be precise. So I started making calls. Quiet ones. To people who still owed me favors. People who remembered who built the foundation they now stood on. I asked questions, gathered confirmations, followed every thread until the picture was crystal clear. Lucas wasn't acting alone. He had an internal ally. Someone on the board who stood to gain just enough to look the other way. Greed is a language I understand well, and it always leaves fingerprints. Over the next week, I laid low. Observed. Watched how Lucas carried himself at family dinners. More animated than usual. More distracted, checking his phone under the table. He was trying to hold it all together, but I could see the pressure building behind his eyes. He thought he was being slick, but what he didn't realize was that the walls were already listening. One night, I heard him on a call out in the backyard. The screen door was cracked open just enough. He was pacing near the patio, his voice hushed but sharp. I don't care what the old guard thinks. If we don't move now, we lose our window. The numbers are solid. And no, I'm not showing them the raw data. They'd just slow us down. I didn't move, didn't blink, just stood in the shadows and let the words settle. No one likes to be called the old guard, but it's worse when it's said like a joke, like deadweight, like you're a barrier, not a builder. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the line between letting people learn and letting them burn everything down. I'd try to stay out of the way, try to give him space to prove himself. But this wasn't ambition anymore. This was recklessness, wrapped in a smile. And if no one else was going to stop him, I would. I waited until the house was quiet. No kids running around. No screens flashing in the background. No Lucas with his ever-buzzing phone, pretending to be present while his mind worked overtime on the next pitch. Just me and my daughter, standing at the kitchen counter, 2 mugs between us, and the kind of silence that feels like it's been waiting for years to be filled. She was cutting fruit for the kids' lunches. Absent-mindedly. Her hands moved, but her eyes were elsewhere. I watched her for a moment, wondering when she'd become so much like her mother, graceful, tired, strong in that quiet, unbreakable way. And yet, I could see it. The tension. The way her shoulders never really relaxed anymore. "I need to talk to you," I said gently. She paused, glanced up, then nodded like she already knew this wasn't going to be a casual chat. She didn't say anything, just waited. So I took a breath and told her what I'd found. The manipulated numbers. The offshore buyer. The hidden documents. I kept my voice steady, careful not to sound accusatory. I wasn't trying to attack her husband. I was trying to protect what we all still had left. When I finished, she didn't react right away. Just placed the knife down, wiped her hands, and finally looked at me. "Dad, I'm sure Lucas has a reason." That was the moment. The one where I felt something in me fracture. Not break, but bend in that slow, painful way that says, you knew this would happen, you just didn't want to believe it. I smiled, small and tired. A reason to bypass the board, to falsify projections. She sighed, like she'd had this conversation in her head 100 times already. He's under pressure. He's doing what he thinks is best. He's trying to grow the business. The business doesn't grow when its roots rot, I said. You know that. I know, she whispered. But it's complicated. Of course it was. Because love makes everything complicated. Because she was trying to be loyal to the man she married, even if she wasn't sure he was making the right choices. Because I wasn't just her father in that moment. I was a threat to her peace, to the version of her life she was trying to keep intact. You think I'm wrong, I said quietly. No, she said too quickly. I think you don't understand how things work now. There it was. The dagger dressed in kindness. You don't understand how things work now. I looked at her, really looked, and in her face, I saw not just the woman I'd raised, but the reflection of every room I've sat in recently where my voice got quieter. Not because I spoke less, but because people listen less. You ever feel invisible in your own home? Like the years you gave, the sacrifices you made, the nights you stayed awake praying for this family, somehow evaporated? Like you're still there, physically, but your relevance has been shelved, labeled outdated, and stored in a mental attic no one visits? That's how I felt. And I don't blame her. Not entirely. The world moves fast. Faster than it used to. Faster than most people can even process. But speed doesn't equal progress. And charm doesn't equal wisdom. I wanted to tell her that. Wanted to remind her that the man she married was clever, yes, but clever men are often the first to mistake noise for value. Instead, I said, I'm not trying to control anything. I just don't want you waking up one day with nothing left to protect. She looked down, biting her lip. Then she said, I trust him. And I said, I trust you. She didn't respond. Just finished packing the lunchboxes. Zipped them shut. Carried them to the fridge like we hadn't just touched the edge of something that might never be fully repaired. That night, I went to bed early. Or at least, I pretended to. But I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling again, remembering when she was little and used to sneak into our room after nightmares. How small she was. How tightly she gripped my shirt as she fell asleep again beside me. Back then, she believed I could protect her from anything. And now, she was protecting someone else from me. That's the strange cruelty of getting older. You become the one people feel they need to manage, to gently push aside, to thank politely, while ignoring completely. But I'm still here, still thinking, still watching. And if they won't hear my voice, they'll feel my footsteps. They think I've been sitting still. That I've spent the last few years watching the world pass me by while sipping coffee and reminiscing about the good old days. They see the silence, the slow pace, the worn slippers by the door, and they assume I've surrendered, that I gave up the game. But the truth is, I've just been playing from a different seat. There's something powerful about being underestimated, about being seen as no longer a threat. People speak freely around you. They drop their guards. They forget to hide their motives. They assume your eyes don't see as sharply, that your ears don't hear as clearly. What they forget is that wisdom doesn't fade. It sharpens. The day I sold part of my shares, I didn't walk away from the table. I flipped the board, drew new lines, and rewrote the rules from underneath. I created shell structures, diversified through silent partnerships, invested not in logos, but in people, young, smart, ethical minds I believed in. I became a ghost in the system, not hiding, just shifting form. And while others built empires with their names etched on glass doors, I built networks. Invisible ones. Resilient ones. Ones that didn't need attention to function. Over time, I embedded myself into places that mattered. Venture groups. Emerging funds. Startups that weren't flashy, but were stable. I used names I trusted, former students, old colleagues, friends who'd earned more than a favor. I didn't need to be seen. I just needed to be present. In the cracks of every decision no one thought I was part of. That's how I found them. The rival company Lucas was trying to sabotage. It wasn't personal to him. Just competition. Numbers on a slide deck he could manipulate. But to me, they weren't rivals. They were part of my circle. My quiet circle. A firm I helped incubate 3 years ago through a back-channel fund I co-designed. Lucas never knew it. No one in the family did. Because that's how I built it. Layers deep, scrub clean of my name, but pulsing with my values. And they were thriving. Not because they were louder, but because they listened better. They valued people. They didn't overpromise. They didn't fake projections. They didn't chase headlines. They chased sustainability. And when they heard about Lucas's scheme, they called me. Not for help, not for permission, just to let me know, we're ready. That was the moment I realized the board was already shifting beneath Lucas's feet. He just hadn't noticed yet. You ever watch someone lean back in a chair without realizing one leg is missing? That's where he was, confident, cocky, running his mouth in rooms he didn't understand, while the structure he stood on began to hollow out beneath him. And I didn't have to lift a finger, because I'd already spent years laying down the pieces. This wasn't revenge. It was math, momentum, timing. The rival firm, my firm, was planning a strategic partnership, a quiet merger that would shift influence, restructure voting power, the kind of deal that wouldn't make headlines, but would send a shockwave through the internal ecosystem. Lucas thought he was negotiating from a position of power. What he didn't know was that the people on the other side of the table already had dinner with me 3 nights ago. They asked me if I wanted my name back in the game. I said no. Because this wasn't about reclaiming spotlight. It was about correcting imbalance. About making sure the future of something I once built wouldn't be left in the hands of someone who treated it like a trophy. You know, there's a freedom that comes with not needing credit anymore. When you're young, you chase recognition like oxygen. You want your work acknowledged, your name attached to the success. But after enough years, after enough losses, enough funerals, enough nights alone, you realize legacy isn't about applause. It's about impact. Quiet, lasting impact. It's about being the reason something good survived, even if no one ever knows why. So I stayed in the shadows and let the pieces move. The merger was scheduled. The funds were aligned. The board had been briefed, selectively, of course. Lucas still thought he was running the show, still smiled that practice smile, still pitched his plans to anyone who'd listen. But the clock was ticking. And I didn't need a shout to be heard. I just needed to wait for the right door to open. Because soon, there'd be a meeting. One he couldn't control. One he couldn't walk out of. One where I'd finally step into the light. Not to speak over him, but to speak through him. And when that happens, he'll learn that some games aren't won by moving faster. They're won by knowing the board better than anyone else in the room. The boardroom was sleek. Too sleek. The kind of place built to impress rather than function. Walls lined with glass, light bouncing off polished metal surfaces, chairs that looked more like art than furniture. Everyone was dressed like the future, tailored suits, thin laptops, smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Lucas stood at the head of the table like he owned the building. Confident, composed, one hand resting on a tablet, the other gesturing casually as he laid out his grand vision. This merger, he said, is more than a business move. It's a philosophy shift, a transition from tradition to innovation. They nodded, some out of interest, others out of habit. He had a way of saying nothing with authority, wrapping vague promises in buzzwords until people stopped asking real questions. And this room, this world, was built for that kind of charm. Everyone was playing a part. Everyone except me. I stood just outside the room, waiting. I wasn't on the calendar. My name wasn't printed on a placard. No one expected the old man in the hallway to be anything more than a visitor, maybe someone's retired mentor tagging along for nostalgia's sake. But when the door opened and the president of the company saw me, he stopped mid-step. Then he smiled. Not the polite, corporate smile. The real kind. The kind that says, you showed up. Just like you said you would. Mr. Alex, he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Thank you for coming." And just like that, everything froze. Lucas turned. The blood drained from his face so fast I could almost hear it. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't speak. Not a word. I stepped into the room slowly, deliberately, not to cause a scene, not to assert dominance, but because I knew what my presence meant. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to explain. Sometimes, presence alone is louder than any speech. The president pulled out a chair for me. At the table. Not behind it. Not on the sidelines. At the table. I sat down, folded my hands, and waited. Lucas cleared his throat. I wasn't aware Mr. Alex would be joining us today. The president looked at him, expression neutral. He's one of the original architects of the enterprise. We're not moving forward without his insight. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was a correction. And in that instant, the power in the room shifted. You could feel it, like a draft blowing through an open window no one noticed before. Lucas tried to recover, pulled up a slide, spoke a little faster, threw in a few more graphs. But it was different now. The room wasn't just listening. It was comparing, measuring, noticing. And when I finally spoke, I didn't need to dismantle him. I just asked questions. How did you calculate the year 2 growth curve? He stumbled. We used model projections based on aggressive scenarios. I nodded. Did you adjust for retention rates from the past fiscal year? A pause. Not directly. But did you include compliance risk from the overseas entity? It's minimal. Based on what data? He blinked. I leaned back. Let the silence speak. You ever watch a man realize the ground beneath him isn't solid? That was Lucas. His voice got thinner. His explanations longer. His charm didn't work in this light. Not here. Not now. Because the people around him weren't looking at a rising star anymore. They were watching someone unravel in the presence of real weight. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't expose the whole story. Not yet. That wasn't the point of this meeting. This was just the introduction. A reminder that I was still here, still thinking, still capable of shaping the room without ever needing to dominate it. The president closed his folder. I believe we need to revisit the terms of this merger, he said. We'll schedule a second review next week. With full participation. Lucas didn't object. He just sat there, nodding like he understood. But his eyes, they were loud. Loud with panic. Loud with the realization that whatever game he thought he was playing, he wasn't winning anymore. As the meeting ended, people stood and stretched. Conversations shifted to other matters. But I stayed seated for a moment longer, watching the room for what it was, a chessboard that had been tilted back into balance. Lucas avoided my gaze as he left. And I didn't chase him. Didn't gloat. Didn't need to. Because that's the thing about power. When you truly have it, you don't have to raise your voice. You just have to show up. And let the silence do the rest. By the time I walked into that room, the walls already knew what was coming. No one said it, of course. Everyone was too polite for that. But you could feel it in the way they straightened their backs, adjusted their ties, and avoided each other's eyes. Lucas was already seated, his laptop open, the usual confidence stretching tight across his face. He greeted people like nothing had changed, like the last meeting hadn't cracked the foundation beneath his feet. But I could see it, the tension behind his smile, the calculation behind every breath. He knew, and still, he clung to the illusion that charm could still carry him through. I didn't bother with small talk. I sat at the table, opened my folder, and waited for the chair to start. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a reckoning. And everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, came to witness it. Lucas launched into his report first. Updated projections, revised language, a subtle attempt to reframe the conversation without admitting fault. He moved quickly, skipping over inconsistencies, avoiding specifics, pushing forward with the same polished words that used to get him applause. But not today. Not anymore. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't posture. I just laid out the facts. Calmly. Clearly. I showed the original data sets, the source documents he never thought anyone would dig up. I explained the discrepancies, the inflated growth models, the unrevealed risks. I listed the offshore entities and their legal histories, pointed out the gaps in compliance, the signatures made without approval. And I watched the room shift, slowly, quietly. The same people who once nodded at every word Lucas said were now staring at their papers, seeing it all differently, seeing him differently. Lucas tried to interrupt, tried to say it was a misunderstanding, that things moved fast in today's market, that innovation required a little flexibility. But every excuse just made the silence around him louder. Because this wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about trust. And when trust breaks, it doesn't shatter like glass. It unravels, thread by thread, until there's nothing holding the shape together. I didn't accuse him. I didn't call him names. I just asked questions he couldn't answer. Not because they were complicated, but because the truth behind them was too simple to hide. He shifted in his chair, looked to the board for support, but no one met his eyes. The air was thick, and not a soul moved to save him. Someone asked for a vote. No anger, no debate, just resolution. Lucas was removed from decision-making authority, pending full review. His contracts frozen, his access restricted. They didn't say it outright, but the message was clear. He was done, and everyone knew it, especially him. He looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw what was behind the ambition and the noise. Fear, not of punishment, but of being seen, truly seen, for what he had become. Someone who thought speed was strength. That performance was leadership. That legacy could be faked if you moved fast enough. But legacy has weight, and you can't carry it if you were never built to hold it. The meeting ended without celebration. Just papers closing, chairs shifting, voices low. I stood up slowly, collected my folder, and that's when I saw her. My daughter. She was standing just outside the door, holding onto the frame like she needed it to stay upright. I don't know how long she'd been there. Maybe long enough to hear everything. Maybe just enough to see her husband fall apart. Her eyes were wide, full of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not sadness, not anger, just clarity. We didn't say anything. Not right away. She looked at Lucas, then back at me. Her hands were trembling, and when I stepped past her, I thought she might turn away. But instead, she reached for my arm, just gently, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. "Dad," she said, and it hit me harder than anything else that day. Because for years, I've been called father, pops, grandpa, even Alex in moments where I was more background than blood. But now, she said like it meant something again, like she remembered. I nodded, didn't speak. There was nothing to add, nothing to fix. The damage had been done, and now, maybe, the healing could begin. I walked out into the afternoon light. It was warm on my face, and for the first time in a long time, I walked with no weight on my shoulders. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Didn't need applause, or validation, or even thanks. I had spoken. I had been heard. And in that silence, heavy and still, everything changed. Because sometimes the loudest thing a man can do is speak with calm and let the truth echo on its own. I walked home. Didn't call a ride. Didn't check my phone. Just stepped outside, pulled my coat tight around me, and let my feet find the pavement one step at a time. The city moved around me as if nothing had happened. Cars honking in the distance, bikes weaving between lanes, someone laughing too loud a few blocks over. But inside me, everything was different. Lighter, quieter, settled. There's a strange kind of peace that comes when you stop needing to be heard and realize you finally were. Not through volume, not through force, but through presence, through truth. For so long, I had carried the weight of being invisible in my own story. Not because anyone took my voice, but because I handed it away, slowly, over time, in the name of peace, of patience, of not wanting to be a burden. And that's the danger, isn't it? You silence yourself long enough, and people start to believe you have nothing left to say. But today proved otherwise. The sun was already low when I turned onto my street. Everything around me looked the same. Same cracks in the sidewalk, same rusted mailbox, same wind chimes on the porch across the road, but it all felt newly placed, as if the furniture of my life had been rearranged overnight. I wasn't walking home as a man, trying to hold his dignity together. I was walking home whole. No one had given that back to me. I'd taken it. When I reached the gate, I noticed the porch light was on. She was standing there, my daughter, arms folded tight against her chest, hair pulled back in a loose knot, eyes swollen but steady. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked like someone who'd been waiting, not just for me to come down the sidewalk, but for this moment to exist. I slowed as I reached the steps. For a second, neither of us spoke, just stood in the quiet that years of unspoken things had built between us. I searched her face for blame, for regret, for any sign that she'd sided too long with silence. But I didn't find it. What I found was something smaller, softer, recognition. She took a step forward, opened the screen door, let it creak just like it used to when she was a kid sneaking outside after bedtime. "Do you want to come in?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. I nodded, walked up the steps, and stopped just inside the threshold. The hallway smelled like cinnamon and dust, the kind of scent that clings to time itself. I looked around, not because anything had changed, but because I had. I wasn't stepping into a house that pitted me. I was stepping back into a space that finally remembered who I was. She stood next to me now, closer than I expected. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I know, and I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner. You had reasons. You needed to believe in him. I understand." She nodded, swallowed hard. "Thank you," she whispered, "for protecting what we couldn't see." And then it came, quietly, simply like she'd been holding it in the back of her throat for years. "Dad." Just that. Not Alex. Not you. Not some awkward distance masked as affection. Just Dad. And I didn't say anything right away, because that single word held more weight than anything said in those boardrooms. More than any vote, any document, any silent nod of respect for men in suits. That word brought me home. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We didn't dive into years of things unsaid. Some moments don't ask for repairs. They ask for rest. And in that doorway, we both found it. I stayed for dinner. Simple pasta. The kids ran circles around the table. She laughed at something her youngest said, and for a while, it felt like the world had been reset by something honest. I didn't bring up Lucas. She didn't either. That part of the story would settle in its own time. When the night ended, I stood by the front door again. Same coat, same shoes, but different footing. She walked me out. "I'll see you soon," she said. "I'm not going anywhere," I answered. She smiled. It wasn't the smile of a daughter trying to please a father. It was the smile of a woman who'd finally remembered where she came from. And as I walked back down the path, one last thought came to me. Not bitter, not proud, just clear. Sometimes the only thing a man needs is to stand tall again. Not in the eyes of the world, not in headlines or bank statements, but in the mirror and in the doorway of his own home.